You had the Vietnam War going on, Cold War with the Russians. The economy was in shambles, had one of the worst recessions since the Depression was going on. 12 months before my dad became president, to paint the economic picture, actually very similar to what we're going through today, 12 months before he became president, the price of oil on the free market, a barrel of oil was $3 to $4. Over the next 12 months, the price of oil jumped over 400% to $12 a barrel. Now, can you imagine today if the price of oil went up 400%? Unemployment was hovering around 6.5% at that time. It would later grow over the next 2 years to about over 8%. You had inflation that was starting. You had a war in Vietnam, a Cold War with the Russians. This was a scary time. This was a constitutional crisis because you had a man who was going to take the oath of office that had not been elected by the American people. So we went into the East Room. Mom held the Bible. Dad took the oath of office. But the country was scared. The country was concerned. That night, I remember after the swearing in, we went into the Oval Office and took our first family portrait behind the desk. It had been cleared off. Nixon had cleared off his desk, and Dad laid down the Bible, and we sat there and took a family picture. And it was very strange because I started thinking, wait a second, 10 months ago my dad was a congressman from Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I would have walked by the White House and those gates and fences just like everybody else and looked through them and wondered what the heck they do in the White House. And here, 10 months later, our family has been catapulted over that fence. Very unique time. So, now, this is funny. You would think after your father becomes president of the United States, you get to live in the White House, right? That night, because Nixon had left so quickly, unexpectedly, with the resignation, they were not able to pack all their clothes and their belongings. So even though President Nixon and his wife Pat left and went to California, they left their daughter and son-in-law, David Eisenhower, at the White House for the next 7 days to pack up all their clothes and belongings. So that night, after Dad takes the oath of office, he becomes president, we don't get to move in. We have to go back to our little home in Alexandria, Virginia, and go back, and we lived there for 7 or 8 days before we get to move in the White House. And you ladies out there are going to appreciate this. I will never forget my mother standing over the stove that night going, "Jerry, something's wrong here. You just became president of the United States and I'm still cooking." That was our reality. It's just what it was. And the next morning, can you imagine the next morning my dad walks out on the front steps of our little house in suburbia and commutes to the office, which is the Oval Office. And literally there are neighbors of years, 20 years, are standing on the street corner there yelling, "Great new government job, Jerry." I mean, that's really what it felt like. So, which, if you think about it, was probably a very healing thing for the country. You'd gone from this President Nixon, who had an enemies list, and there was a paranoia and all these things, very secretive, to Jerry Ford, this guy from the Midwest, Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was a good thing to happen for the country, a very good thing, even though Watergate had happened. So, I've got so much I could tell you. I'm just kind of trying to hit some of the highlights here, and I know we want to do some question and answers. I guess I'll touch on the Nixon pardon for just a second, and then I want to share with you probably the biggest lesson I've learned since Dad's death, I guess, since he passed away, and when you have a chance to look back on what his life was about. So it's interesting. The economic times we're facing now is the same thing Dad faced. The stock market, 6 months before Dad became president, was over 1,000 points. In the next 6 to 8 months, the stock market back in 1974 dropped over 45%. It was down to about 560, and you had an energy crisis. You had oil going up 400%. You had inflation while Dad was president, got up to 14.5%. You had unemployment that in some parts of the country reached over 8-9%, particularly in Michigan, Detroit, the auto industry. You had a war in Vietnam. Today we have a war in Iraq. The good news I would bring you is that even though Dad was president only 2.5 years, when he got out of office, the stock market was back over 1,000 points. He'd gotten all the troops home from Vietnam. Inflation, he was able to cut inflation from a high of 14.5% down to about 4.2%, and created about 4 million new jobs, and the economy started rolling again. So that's the good news. We'll get through whatever we're going through. We've been through it before. It's interesting because Dad worked with a Democratic Congress, and they butted heads a lot. That Democratic Congress at that time wanted to spend their way out of the recession, and Dad was a moderate, conservative, certainly fiscally conservative Republican, and his biggest fear was building up the deficit. And he was trying to keep the budget at that time below $300 billion. What's the budget now? We're talking trillions, right? His fight in 1975 was he drew a line in the sand and said he was not going to let the federal budget go beyond $300 billion. He looked back, and this is the way he thought. He looked back and he saw in the early 1900s and 20s and 30s, the budget was usually no more than 5 to 10% of gross national product. And he saw it grow in the 60s and 70s, and now it was up to about 25%. And he saw that trend of carrying so much debt and deficit was just not good. And I could tell, I was saying at lunch, that's not how he lived at home. At home, I'll never forget the day, and this is the way Dad thought. The day he came home and we celebrated the day he paid off our mortgage. I'll never forget that day. I was just a little kid. And he came home, he was so happy. He says, I've paid off our home loan. We're debt-free. And that's the way he thought. And that's the way he ran his family, and that's the way he thought the federal government should not carry that kind of, deficit spending. And my mom used to call him and say, Jerry, you're so tight. And he'd say thrifty. He thought thrifty was a better word. But you know what? Our family always slept very well because of the way he handled our personal family finances. We knew that about him. And that's the way he looked at the federal government. He got in a tremendous amount of trouble and bad headlines when New York City was going broke back in 1975, and they needed a federal bailout. And the headline was, Ford tells New York City drop dead. But now, eventually, yes, did he, working with Congress, get New York City some bailout money? Yes, he did. But first, he told them they had to get their own financial house in order. And they had to solve some of the high salaries they had and overextended pensions and things like that. So that's where he came from economically. So he dealt with a Congress that was almost 2/3 Democratic. He had very little, but he vetoed a lot of spending. 66, I think it was 66 vetoes. A lot of some, I think about 15% of them got overridden. But he prevented Congress from spending their way out of the recession. So that's how he approached it, and he felt very strongly about that.